Now 'tis very late, and the final chapter is upon us. And before we begin, a necessary thank you to my partner, Kate, who has endured this most ludicrous of projects in good humour for the most part. And I am truly, truly thankful for that. All right. Chapter 78. Now 'tis very late. Dawn is the next event to consider. Candles have been allowed to burn all the way out. No one has uncorked a bottle in some time, while Tenebrae slumbers beneath the canopy of the Chinese sofa, whilst her cousins, sprawled in chairs, are intermittently awake and listening. All seems to them interrupted by enigmata, blown through as by winds it is generally better not to be out in. What I cannot quite see to the end of, confesses Euphemia, is Mason's return to America abruptly, as if unable to desert his family again. What choice has he, this time, but to present them with the sudden voyage by sea and carry them all to Philadelphia? Yet what could have brought him here again? Or else, what frightened him away from Gloucestershire? Plague? There was ever plague, the weight of Rebecca's ghost. How, if she were content to have him in Sapperton, unless she came at last to wish him gone, even at the price of knowing they would never be buried together, as he must also have known. Yet at the end she could not abide him as he had come to be, and so she turned terrible, as she had ever been a shadow's edge away from doing anyway. The fear, the resolve, poor Mason. He gathered them all with the force of his belief. Poe, 'twas madness. You have looked upon madness, have you, young Thelma? Any Saturday night down at the hospital, sir, a Spanish dollar to the warder purchases you more entertainment than your ribs may bear, my guarantee upon that. What? Bedlam in America? Mind yourself, lad. When the hook of night is well set, and when all the children are at last irretrievably detained within their dreams, slowly into the room begin to walk the black servants, the Indian poor, the Irish runaways, the Chinese sailors, the overflowed from the mad hospital, all unchosen Philadelphia, as if something outside, beyond the cold wind, has driven them to this extreme of seeking refuge. They bring their scars, their pox-pitted cheeks, their burdens and losses, their feverish eyes, their proud fellowship in a mobility that is to be, whose shape none inside this house may know. Lomax wakes, sweating from a poisoned dream. Euphemia has ascended the back stairs as the former Zab Cherrycoke those in front to slumber. Athelma and Depew, unconscious, Bray and the twins, have all vanished back into the innocence of unconsciousness now. Ives is off at his midnight junto. Yet Mr. Lespark and the Reverend remain. The room continues to fill up, the dawn not to arrive. And if it were naught, if it all were naught but madmen's sleep, the years we believed were real and deep, as lives, as sorrows, bearing us each one, blindly along, our lines relentless run. Who was that? Lomax Lespark, in a stuperously low-level panic. I know that voice. He's in here, his brother Wade marvels, blurry as a bat in a candle stump flicker. Damn! How's he do it? He's supposed to be either in chains or out upon the roads, not in this house. Have a cup, Tim. The Reverend, offering his brother-in-law's best cervical. Circle. Ever fancied the opening lines to Book 1 myself? You mean, the poet, nodding in thanks, at Penn's ascension of the Delaware, savages from the banks covertly stare, as at the advent of some puissant prince, before whom chaos reigned, and order since. Proceeding then to recite the Pennsylvaniad, sotto voce, as he wanders the room, among the others, the untold others. Will you be leaving before Christmas, Wicks? What do I say? Your servant, sir. I meant that I should welcome your company as your mediation in visiting with Mr. Mason's widow and children, if they are yet in town, though I am damned if I can see how to do it much before Epiphany, there being an alarm clock even next to my chamber pot these days. Thanks to the American Society, they are here and cared for. I have heard that Mrs. Mason will return to England with the younger children, whilst William and Dr. Isaac will remain. Then I should like to meet them in particular. Perhaps I may find a way to help. Brother, you have moments. Aye, we call 'em Philadelphia minutes. On entering Mason's rooms at the George Tavern, Franklin is greeted by an odour he knows and would rather not have found. He resists the impulse to take out his watch, ever comforter and scripture to him. He hears children, gathered somewhere in their own rectangle invisible. Mary stands before a window looking upon an alleyway. What a desperate night it's been. I don't know if he really wants to see you, or if it's more of his illness. He sleeps now, but he's dreaming and talking, so I expect he'll be with us soon. I received his letter, having this year been much vexed, this god-awful disintegration of power. 'Twas only now, but forgive me, Mrs. Mason. I whine. She sinks with a sidewise contraction of her body into a couch designed more to encourage the illusions of youth than to console the certainties of age. Outside rackets the traffic of 2nd Street. Please excuse me if I do not immediately sit. At 80 it requires some advance work, so my sympathies must precede me. She manages for him a smile, whose muscular cost he can feel in his own face. He leans upon his cane. We met in times easily as dark as these. We transacted honourably some items of philosophical business. I put him up for fellow in our American society, though his desires were ever fixed upon the royal. He wanted them, so to want him as a member. We were but colonials, amusing enough in our way, and of course he was touched, yet Philadelphia is not London. Upon Rebecca's tombstone he has put F.A.S. after his own name, so it means much to him. I expect you are surprised at gesturing behind her as a wife might at her house, half apologizing, half welcoming. Yet 'twas overnight. One moment they were at their own table, in from coats and stone walls and mud lanes, the loaf steaming, the dishes going round. The next they were in some kind of great loud wagon, bound for Southampton. Money that had saved. But why? I asked him why, every day till I saw it was making him worse. We must go to America. That was nearly all he'd say. He has a way of saying America in his father's voice. We must all go together. Is it for leaving William and Dr. Isaac behind all those years ago? I would gladly have remained in England with the children. But at my age, sir, it is a terrible choice. To find and sweep from the last corners of Sapperton and Stroud, from Bisley, some pitiful little heap of mercy, or to remain with him and his madness, which grows ever less hopeful in our utter dependence upon the board of longitude. Praise heaven, a fine choice. Surely the Royal Society. Alas, though he has friends there, the Reverend Maskelyne has been truly gentle with Charles, has remained ever by him. Charles believes inflexibly that the society could not Forgive him the letters he wrote them from Plymouth so long ago, that too many resented him for speaking up then, for daring from his lower station to suggest another plan. To speak of the final 7 years between Dixon's and death and Mason's is to speculate, to uncertain avail. Obituaries mention a long descent, suffering for several years, melancholy aberrations of mind. His illness at the end was never stipulated. Yet 'tis possible, after all, down here, to die of melancholy. He had returned to his earthly father, yet never reconciled. In his will, Charles forgave Mason the price of the loaf he had taken every day for his table, and that was all. Mason had married again and become the father of 5 more boys and a girl, yet he never put Rebecca to earth, though she herself, to appearance, might at last sigh, relax and move on, one would think, with old Mopery come to rest where he'd started out from. It is the way the journeymen become masters, and the ingenuous wise. It is a musical piece returning to its tonic home. Nothing more would be expected of him now than some quiet coda. His efforts at refining the longitude tables of Mayer avoided any risk of looking into the real sky, as if, against his father's wishes, having once studied the stars, now, too late, he were renouncing them, though he got out under the heavens every now and then, sometimes alone, usually with children along, for whom he adjusted oculars and screws, and peered only rarely, gingerly, starward. As Rebecca withdrew into silence, eventually complete, Mason's melancholy deepened. If he was no longer to be found in Sapperton, if she was no longer to be found in Sapperton, if he insisted that her silence be rejection and not contentment, that may have helped push him away, back to America. Whatever it was, his despair by then was greater than Mary had ever seen, or could account for. I thought I knew him a little. Children all over the place, Charlie bent over his logarithms all night, a new stomach onset arriving with each post. Dr. Isaac had had his father back for 10 years, yet still he relied upon Willie to help him along, as his older brother had ever done, coming to accept it as naturally as the day. "He will never speak of her," Willie said once, "nor will Aunt Hester much. They ought to, you know. It isn't fair. It's as if they're ashamed of her for something. Grandfather, when he is displeased with me, says that I heard him. He should never have said that. And he said I was named after the doctor who lost her, that Dad hated me that much. He wanted it always on me, like a notch upon a pig's ear. Grandfather is a sour and beggarly old fool. You are named for Newton, whom Dad admires greatly. Neither has ever denied the other his direct gaze. Who told you 'twas Newton? Doc keeps on, finely, quivering, resolute. Aunt Hetty, On your oath, Will, ask her. I did, mindful as ever. She went on as, the name may have come up, who knows? Your father talks unendingly, but I can't recall much of anything he's said. So now, I really shall have to take your sworn word, Willie, and hope you do understand how serious this is. How should I ever lie to you? 'Tis I, remember me, the taller one. Without considering, Doc reaches up for the hand that is not there, finding his brother's shoulder instead, which will have to do. When news reached Mason that Dixon had died, he went about for the rest of the day as if himself stricken. I'd meant to see him this summer, he repeated over and over. At last, I must go up there. I'll come with you, offered Dr. Isaac. The boy works for his bread, the elder Mason growled. He's not a man of science. Leave him be. Hire a weaver for a se'nnight. There are plenty of them to choose from. I'll pay you back any sum it loses ye. With what? Stardust? Presently, curses ringing in their ears, Mason and his son were out upon the north road together, bundled against the cold, stopping in at every tavern upon the way. Mason, for some reason, found himself unable to stop looking at Doc, recalling that the lad had never been out of these hills, nor even down to Oxford. Out on the road like this, he seemed suddenly no longer a child. They stopped overnight in Birmingham, and again in York. They ate and drank with waggoners and fugitives and commercial travellers. As they lie side by side in bed, Mason finds he cannot refrain from telling his son bedtime stories of Dixon. He was ever seeking to feel something he had hitherto not felt. In Philadelphia, he was fascinated by Dr. Franklin's Leyden jar, as with the doctor's curious history, cheerfully admitted to, of self-electrocution thereby, on more occasions than he can now remember. Here's the lumina of the lab, leading the surveyors among globes of glass, insulators of porcelain, a miniature forge, a magnetizing station, gear trains of lignum vitae, an engine out of which protrudes a great crank, bench tops strewn with lenses, lamps, alembics, retorts, condensers, coils, at length to a squatly inelegant, wide-mouthed vessel in a dark corner of the workroom. 3-inch sparks from this contrivance are routine, and when ye hook a line of 'em up's in cascade. Well, many's the time I've found myself out upon the pavement, no memory of removal from where I'd been, and a hole in the brick wall between, about my size and shape. Here now, just take hold of this terminal. Mason, aghast, of course, and not about to touch any terminal, withdraws. Upon the pretext of business with Dr. Franklin's assistant, a gnome-like stranger named Ingvar, whose unsettling grin and reluctance to speak provoke from Mason increasingly desperate monologue. Whilst for his part, Dixon is eagerly hastening to handle all the apparatus he can find that might have electric fluid running through it. That was a good one. And here's what's this, with the 3 great springs coming out. Ah, yes, 2 go in the ears thus, and the other with this Y adapter into your nostrils. There we are. Now then. Master, master, Ingvar scuttling near. Not now, Ingvar, unless of course you'd like to assist in a little spark-length calibration. Aye, no, master. There now, Ingvar, 'tis but a couple of toes, calloused quite well, I see, more than enough to withstand the electric tension. Try not to squirm, there's a good fellow. It tickles. Fine with me, as Howard says to Howard, only please try not to kick that switch to the main battery, lest Mr. Dixon, oh dear, Ingvar, what did I just say? So forcefully that his cue-tie breaks with a loud snap. Dixon's hair springs erect, each strand a right line, pointing outward along a perfect radius from the centre of his head. What might be called a smile is yet asymmetric and a drool. His eyeballs, upon inspection, are seen to rotate in opposite directions and at differing speeds. Releasing Ingvar, who makes himself scarce, Franklin opens the switch at last, and Dixon staggers to a settee. Sir, the doctor in some concern, I trust you've not been inconvenienced unduly. Suppose I used tinfoil, Dixon upon his back replies, instead of silver. How many of these jars should I need to reproduce that effect? Next morning at breakfast, Doc is curious to know. Did you ever cast his horoscope? Quite early on, though I never told him. His natal moon in Aquarius, and in Leo, the sign of his birth, he is blessed with a stellium of Mercury, Venus, and Mars. Mars being also conjunct his sun, though both are regrettably squared, Jupiter and Saturn. His bread, that is, ever by the sweat of his brow. So did it prove to be. Yet vis martis enough, and more, for the journey. He may have done my horror on the sly for all I know. Rum thing not to know of someone, isn't it? But he knew how to cast a chart, and had the current year's ephemeris by memory. Damn, he knew his astronomy, though I teased him with it now and then. Meant to bring you to see him one day. He had heard enough about you. You spoke of me. You, Willie, the babies. We talked about our children. He had 2 girls, young women, I should say. Ah, and you were hoping. Who? What? Do you take me for a village busybody such as your Aunt Hetty? 2 sons, explains Doc, 2 daughters, and a father wishing, as fathers do, to be a grandfather. Sure of that. Mason Dixon grandbabies. He risks casting at his father a direct look of provocation that Mason finds he may no more flinch from than answer to. For the next hours, then, neither speaks more than he must. At ease, for the first time together, with the silence of the day. 'Twas what Dixon ever wished from him, to proceed quietly. I thought if I ever did this, Doc tells his father later, out upon the road, 'twould be alone and headed the other way, to London. You're like me. At your age, I couldn't wait to be out of the Vale. Why did you ever come back? You were here, and Will, and your mother. Doc flashes him a thoughtful look. You never speak of her. Here they are, fallen upon the drumhead of the day. 'Tis 20 years. Perhaps I've passed beyond the need to. But then Mason can see the struggle the lad is having between going on and keeping silence. Of course, we must speak of her. Whatever you wish to know of her, I shall try. It doesn't have to be right away. Snow is nearly upon them, and night soon to descend. Shelter has not so far presented itself. At the last of the daylight, providentially at the end of York, they smell wood smoke with a sensible fat component and follow their noses to the Merry Ghosts, which is in fact a haunted inn, as the apple trees planted too close to it testify, growing directly away from the structure, as far as their roots will permit, often at quite unstable angles. Not promising, mutters Mason. What choice? As they step into the busy saloon, all to the wiping of mouths, falls dead silent. Faces gathered in a circle about a dark lanthorn and a heap of stolen purses look up in varying degrees of annoyance. A gigantic and misanthropic tapster comes out of the shadows. Private party tonight, gents. Where's the next inn? Mason is about to inquire when Doc speaks up. Here then, coves, 'tis Mason and Mason, high tobers of Greenwich, rambling Bearwood, and zoot cheroot, says me early and late, or 'tis be wary of the frigid airy, for the gloak that quiddles. Oh, and pints for all, that's if we may. We? Inquires Mason. The tapster withdraws, the bitter flows, those staring resume business. Mason and Doc find a corner where they may pretend themselves confederates upon the Toby, plotting deeds dark enough to allow them to be left in peace. 'Tis a ring, explains Doc. They're dividing up the day's spoils. Later we'll see the night brigade come in. How do you know all this? Read about it in the Ghastly Fop. 'Tis a weekly now, did you know? I didn't. The coach brings it to Stroud. Round the footpad's table perplexity rules. What did he say? Asks the Brum kiddie. Is that London canting? Closez le gob, he is advised. You're too young yet. But what's it mean? The kiddie persists. Here's what you do, kid. Just go over there and ask 'em what they said. Mason and Mason get an identifiable joint for supper and the best room upstairs to sleep in. They'll murder us in our sleep, suggests Mason. We're not going to sleep. By and large, Doc is correct. The traffic in front, as back in the courtyard of the Merry Ghosts, is prodigious and unceasing. Confidences at best dangerous to hear are screamed heedlessly back and forth all night. I thought it was supposed to be haunted, Mason objects. How can anyone tell in this tohu vabohu? Unless, Doc looks out the window, among all the roarings and whistles, wheel rumbling and low song, there is not a visible soul below. The sky is falling now. Mason sits by the window, waiting for traces of these outspoken spirits to show up against the white descent. At some point, invisible across the room, Dr. Isaac will ask, quietly, evenly, "When did you and she meet? How young were you?" At Bishop, they learned that Dixon had been buried in back of the Quaker meeting house in Staindrop. Dr. Isaac stayed with his father, step for step. At the grave, which by Quaker custom was unmarked, Mason beseeched what dismally little he knew of God to help Dixon through. The grass was long and beaded with earlier rain. A cat emerged from it and stared for a long time, appearing to know them. "Dad," Doc had taken his arm. For an instant, unexpectedly, Mason saw the little boy who, having worried about storms at sea as beasts in the forest, came running each time to make sure his father had returned safely, whose gift of ministering to others Mason was never able to see, let alone accept, in his blind grieving, his queasiness of soul before a life and a death, his refusal to touch the baby, though it was not possible to blame him. The boy he had gone to the other side of the globe to avoid was looking at him now with nothing in his face but concern for his father. "Oh, son!" He shook his head. He didn't continue. "It's your mate," Dr. Isaac assured him. "It's what happens when your mate dies." Solitude grew upon him, despite his nominal return to the social web work. Neighbours near and far, including owners of textile mills he would once never have spat upon, believing him versed in every philosophic art, kept bringing him repair jobs. The workshed grew cluttered with shafts and weft forks, purn winders and pistons, silk reels and boiler gauges. Scents of lavender, wild roses and kitchen smoke passed in and out with bees and wasps. Through the unmortared walls, pierced everywhere with bright openings, to the sunlit garden outside and the abiding day. Mason might be found sitting at a pine table, bowed over a curious mirror. The beings who visited had names and titles and signs of recognition. Often they would approach through number, logarithms, the manipulation of numbers and letters, emerging, as it were, from the symbols. His principal income in those years came from pen and paper work. Laborious, pre-mechanical, his only instrument a set of logarithmic tables, reducing and perfecting Mayer's solar and lunar data. These formed the basis of the Nautical Almanac, which Maskelyne edited, and in whose introduction the AR was generous in acknowledging Mason's work. Mason came to believe that through Taurian persistence he had refined the values to well within an error that entitled him to the £5,000 prize offered by the Board of Longitude. But enemies succeeded in reducing it to an offer of £750, which he refused upon principle, though Mary at the news withdrew in dismay. Did he now include among his enemies Maskelyne? The AR had shared with Mason his delight over the new planet. He had taken it for a comet, wishing Mr. Herschel joy of his great accomplishment. Suddenly the family of planets had a new member, though previously observed by Bradley, Halley, Flamsteed, Lemonnier, the Chinese, the Arabs, everyone it seemed, yet attended to by none of them. 'Twas impossible to find an astronomer in the kingdom who was not wandering about in that epoch, beaming like a booby over the unforeseen enlargement of his realm of study. Yet to Mason it was purgatory, some anti-penultimate blow. What fore inklings of the dark forces of overthrow that assaulted his own mind came visiting. Small stinging presences darting in from the periphery of his senses to whisper, to bite, to inject venoms. Beings from the new planet, infesting. Mason has seen in the glass, unexpectedly, something beyond simple reflection, outside of the world, a procession of luminous phantoms carrying bowls, bones, incense, drums, their attention directed to nothing he may imagine, belonging to unknown purposes, flowing by thick as eels, pauselessly, for how long before or after his interception he could never know. There may be found within the malodorous grotto of the selves a conscious denial of all that reason holds true. Something that knows, unarguably as it knows flesh is sooner or later meat, that there are beings who are not wise or spiritually advanced or indeed capable of human kindness, but ever and implacably cruel, hiding, haunting, waiting, known only to the blood-scented deserts of the night, and any who see them out of disguise are instantly pursued, and none escape. However long and fruitful be the years, till the shadow creeps across the sill plate. Its advent, how mute! Spheres of darkness, darkness impure, plexities of honour and sin we may never clearly sight. For when we venture near, they fall silent. Murdering must be silent, by potions and spells, by summonings from beyond the horizons of spirits who dwell a little over the line between the day and its annihilation, between the numbered and the unimagined, between common safety and ruin ever solitary. The Royal Society had by then divided into men of science, such as Maskelyne and Mr. Hutton, and macaronis, such as Henry Cavendish and Mr. Joseph Banks, a dispute culminating for Maskelyne with his own set of enemies. At the instant he found his name absent from the list of Royal Society Council members for 1783 to 84, and had an excursion into vertigo unsought. At this cusp of vulnerability, Mason, with the exquisiteness of a picador, launched his dart. At the Mitre, of all places, amid pipe fumes and the muffled ring of pewter upon oak, they ended up waving half-eaten chops in lieu of pointed fingers. From an innocent discussion of the great meteor of the summer previous, they are abruptly surrendered to earthly spite. If they are souls falling to earth, becoming incarnate, then 'tis of moment which point of the zodiac they appear to radiate from. Like most of them that night, this had its radiant in Perseus, if that's any help to you. Mason. That was around the other way. Okay. If they are souls falling to earth, becoming incarnate, then 'tis of moment which point of the zodiac they appear to radiate from. Like most of them that night, this had its radiant in Perseus, if that's any help to you. Mason, mimicking the preacherly rise and fall. Perseus, home to most baleful Algol, the Gaul star, when upon its meridian, directly above New York, the American Sodom, the star that others named Lilith, or Satan's, or Medusa's head. Would the soul I seek emerge and fall from a region so attainted? Never. You know that very well, you little viper. What have you ever lost? Even Munn, who enjoyed a brisk punch-up as well as the next truculent sot, now chose rather to pull his brother away, first to another table and presently out the door and on to another tavern altogether. "You'll not dismiss me again," cried Mason. "I failed to see hatred for what it was, believing you but a long-winded fool, ever attempting to buy my regard with gifts in your power. I may have prized your good opinion," Maskelyne, in that meek tone Mason knew promised a stab unannounced, striking instead. "Why should it matter to you? Certainly not out of respect for the better astronomer. 'Twas plain recompense, no more than that. Schehallien, which you rejected, day labour for the Beerval, without which your family should have starved, all in my humble gratitude for being allowed once to approach Bradley. Better we'd starved, for you came closer than you ought, the worse for him. An usurper, is that what you make of me? Must I now be slain? Can you never get beyond it? No need to slay a man who isn't there." Maskelyne understood what Mason meant, not there upon the Royal Society Council. His parsonical scowl dropped from forehead to eyes, as we clench our faces sometimes against sentiment. No records survive, however, of when Neville Maskelyne did or did not weep. What he did do now was turn away from Mason, and for the first time and the last time, not turn back to face him. The last Mason saw of him was the back of his wig. The next year, after several dramatic votes and skirmishes, though not all that many stick-enhanced injuries, everyone in the royal sock ended most frightful chums, and Maskelyne was back on the council, remaining so thereafter, year upon year, till his passing. Mason struggles to wake. He arises, glides to the door, and emerges from an ordinary modern house in one of the plainest cities on earth, to find ascending before him one single dark extended petroglyph, a town-enclosed hillside, upon which lie the all but undamaged remains of an ancient city, late Roman or early Italian temples and public buildings, in taupes and browns, Lombardy poplars of a green, very dark. There is writing on some of the structures, but Mason cannot read it, does not yet know it is writing. Perhaps when night has fallen, he will be able to look up, to question the sky. I think he's waking. She is up and abustle, the children secreting themselves in corners, older ones shepherding younger ones to nearby rooms. Mary beckons Franklin in. Mason is gone grey. Metallic whiskers sprout from his face. Even his eyelashes are grizzled. Franklin is surprised to find that Mason has lost his squint, that as the years have passed, his face has been able somehow to enter the ease of a symmetry it must ever have sought once he abandoned the night sky and took refuge indoors from the day. "I trust you will soon be out of this bed, sir." "Whilst I'm of use," Mason says, "they shan't seek my dissolution, not in the thick of this dispute over the Bradley Orbs, so-called, these being many of them my own. No one wants to repeat what went on between Newton and Flamsteed, excepting perhaps one of Kabbalistic turn, who believes those arrays of numerals to be the magical text that will deliver him to immortality, or suspects that Bradley found something as important as the aberration, but more ominous, something France may not have, or not right away, and Jesuits must not learn of ever. Something so useful and deadly that rather than publish his suspicions or even reduce the data any further, Bradley simply left them as an exercise for anyone strongly enough interested. And what could that be? What phantom shape implicit in the figures? "Ah, you old quizzer!" Franklin tries to beam, Mason continuing to regard him, not pleading, but as if it didn't matter much what Franklin thinks. "'Tis a construction," Mason weakly. "'Tis a great single engine, the size of a continent. I have all the proofs you may require. Not all the connections are yet made. That's why some of it is still invisible. Day by day, the pioneers and surveyors go on. More points are being tied in and soon becoming visible. As above, new stars are recorded and named and placed in almanacs. You've found it, have ye? This certainly isn't that curious design with the trifling cost that you sent me along with your letter. Sir, you have encountered deists before, and know that our Bible is nature, wherein the Pentateuch is the sky. I have found there, written every night in astral gematria, messages of great urgency to our time, and to your continent, sir. Now to be your own as well. May an old continental hope, sir? Mary looks in. Well, young Mary, Mason's eyes elsewhere, unclaimable. It turned out to be simple after all, didn't it? You're safe, Charlie, she whispers. You're safe, she prays. Mary would return to England with the younger children. William and Dr. Isaac, Rebecca's sons, would stay and be Americans, would stay and ensign their father into his death. Mr. Shippen, the Reverend Peters, Mr. Ewing, all commissioners of the line 20 years earlier, now will prove, each in his way, their salvation upon this shore. Since I was 10, said Doc, I wanted you to take me and Willie to America. I kept hoping, every birthday, this would be the year. I knew next time you'd take us. We can get jobs, said William. Save enough to go out where you were. Marry and go out where you were, said Doc. The stars are so close you won't need a telescope. The fish jump into your arms. The Indians know magic. We'll go there. We'll live there. We'll fish there. And you too.